My daughter once told me she was embarrassed to say her mother owned a nail salon in a strip mall off Highway 6 in Houston. She said it quietly, but I heard every word. 10 years later, she stood across from me in a navy blazer asking if she could help manage the business the same day I agreed to sell it for $2.8 million. I remember the exact moment she said it. We were sitting in my car outside the salon. The engine's still running because the air conditioner inside the shop had broken. Again, she stared at her phone and said, "Mom, can you just drop me off around the corner? I don't want my friends to see this place." I nodded and said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that silence can hold more weight than any argument. I came to this country when I was 39 years old with 2 suitcases and $600 in cash folded inside a sweater my sister gave me. I did not speak English well. I knew how to say thank you and sorry and not much else. I cleaned motel rooms. In the mornings, I washed dishes in a small restaurant at night, and on weekends I sat in the back of a nail salon watching and learning. I learned how to shape acrylics, how to listen without interrupting, how to remember names even when my tongue struggled to pronounce them. My marriage did not survive those years. My husband said America changed me. What he meant was I stopped depending on him. One day he left and did not come back. I did not cry in front of my daughter. I woke up the next morning and went to work. When I signed the lease for that small salon, it felt less like a business decision and more like a quiet promise to myself. The space sat between a laundromat and a discount liquor store. The sign above the door was faded and crooked. Inside there were 4 used chairs and a smell of chemicals that never quite left. The first week I opened, I had 3 customers. One of them only came in to ask for directions. I would sit behind the desk during slow hours and watch. People walk past my window without looking in. Sometimes they glanced and then looked away. Like they had already decided something about me, about this place, about what it meant. My daughter stopped bringing her friends home around that time. She said they would not understand. She said people at school talked. I told her it was okay. Even though something inside me tightened every time she avoided saying what I did for a living. There were nights I closed the shop and counted the cash drawer and wondered if everyone else had been right, if this was just a small mistake stretched out over time. But every morning I unlocked the door again, turned on the lights, and waited. I did not try to be the cheapest salon. I did not try to compete with the bigger places with glass walls and bright signs. I focused on the woman sitting across from me. I listened when they talked about their jobs, their marriages, their children growing up too fast. I remembered how they liked their nails shaped, how they took their coffee. I noticed when they seemed quieter than usual, little things. Simple things, things no one taught in business classes. Slowly they came back, one by one. Then they brought friends. Then those friends brought their sisters. The chairs that once stayed empty began to fill. The silence in the room changed into something warmer, something steady. But none of that mattered to the people who had already made up their minds about me. To them I was still the woman with the small salon in the strip mall, still someone to smile at politely and forget, and for a long time I let them believe that. I let them laugh, because I was building something they could not see yet, something that did not look impressive from the outside, but was growing stronger every single day, quietly, patiently. Without needing their approval, I stopped expecting people to walk in after that first month. Instead, I learned to recognize the sound of the door even when it stayed closed, the quiet hum of the ventilation system, the faint vibration from the laundromat next door. Those small sounds became my company. There were days I worked 10 hours and made less than $30. I would sit at the small desk in the corner and eat a sandwich I brought from home, slowly, carefully. As if stretching time could somehow stretch money, I kept a notebook under the register where I wrote down every expense, every bottle of polish, every roll of paper towels, every dollar that came in. I needed to see it all clearly because no one else was going to do it for me. Sometimes I would circle a number and just stare at it, wondering how long I could keep going like this. The landlord came by one afternoon and leaned against the doorframe. He looked around the empty chairs and said, "You know there are other tenants interested in this space." I nodded and told him I understood. I did not argue. I just paid the rent on time and kept the place clean. Across the parking lot there was a larger salon with bright lights and a full staff. They had music playing and customers waiting in line. One of the technicians walked into my shop one day pretending to look for the restroom. She glanced around and smiled in a way that was not kind. Later that week I overheard someone outside say that my place would not last until the end of the year. I did not correct them. I did not defend myself. I went back to filing a set of nails for the one customer who had come in that afternoon. Her name was Carol. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office down the road. She told me she had tried the bigger salon, but it felt rushed. Like no one had time to look at her. I listened as she spoke, not just with my ears, but with attention. I noticed how her shoulders dropped slightly as she relaxed, how she sighed when she sat down. Small details that told me more than her words. When I finished her nails, she looked at them and smiled in a quiet way, not loud, not dramatic, just satisfied. She asked how long I had been open, and I told her a few weeks. She said she would come back. I had heard that before from others who never returned, but something about the way she said it felt different. The next week she came back, and the week after that she brought her coworker. They sat side by side and talked while I worked. I did not interrupt. I let the conversation fill the room. Slowly the salon began to feel less empty, not full, but not hollow either. I started remembering small things about them, what color they preferred, whether they liked their nails shorter or longer, whether they talked a lot or sat quietly. I wrote nothing down. I kept it in my mind. It became a habit, a quiet discipline. I realized I was not just offering a service, I was offering a space where they could sit and not feel rushed, where someone noticed them without needing anything. In return, my daughter still avoided coming by. She would text me instead of stopping in. Sometimes she asked how business was, and I would say it is okay. Even when it was not, I did not want her to worry. Or maybe I did not want to hear the doubt in her voice again. At night when I locked the door and stepped into the parking lot, the neon lights from the liquor store flickered. The air smelled faintly of detergent and asphalt. It was not a place anyone would describe as successful, but it was mine. Every small improvement, every returning customer, every dollar earned honestly felt like a quiet step forward, invisible to most people, but very real to me. I began to notice a pattern in the afternoons around 3 o'clock when the sunlight hit the front window at an angle and the parking lot grew quieter. That was when the women who did not want to be seen in busy places would come in. They did not rush. They did not talk loudly. They sat down slowly and looked around as if checking whether it was safe to relax. I learned to greet them softly and give them space. Not every customer wanted conversation. Some only wanted a place where no one asked too many questions. Carol was the one who changed everything without realizing it. One day, she brought in 3 coworkers at the same time and apologized for the noise before they even sat down. I smiled and told her it was fine. The room felt different that day, fuller, warmer, the sound of voices mixing with the steady rhythm of filing and brushing created something I had not felt before, a sense that this place was becoming real. Not just a small shop, but something people returned to, something they trusted over. The next few weeks more women came in, some because of Carol, some because they had heard about a quiet salon where appointments actually meant something and where no one rushed them out the door. I did not raise my prices. I did not advertise. I focused on consistency, clean tools, steady hands, remembering details. One customer mentioned she liked a certain shade of soft pink. The next time she came in, I had it ready without asking. She looked surprised and then smiled in a way that stayed with me long after she left. Small things began to build into something larger, not quickly, not loudly, but steadily. The bigger salon across the lot started offering discounts and louder music. They placed a sign outside that said walk-ins welcome, no wait. I watched people go in and out of their doors while mine opened less often, but the ones who came to me stayed longer. They talked about their lives, their children leaving for college, their parents getting older, their marriages changing. Over time, I did not give advice. I simply listened and worked, and somehow that was enough. One evening, my daughter finally came into the salon unannounced. She stood just inside the door and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. The chairs were occupied. The room was calm. There was no loud music, only quiet conversation and the soft sound of work being done. She waited until I finished with my client before speaking. She said, "It looks different in here." I nodded and asked if she wanted to sit. She hesitated for a moment and then shook her head. She said she only stopped by because she was in the area. I did not ask anything more. I had learned not to push moments that were not ready, but as she turned to leave, she paused and glanced back. Not embarrassed this time, just thoughtful. That was the first time I saw something shift. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to notice. That night after closing, I counted the register and realized something small but important. I had covered my rent for the month and still had money left over. It was not a large amount, but it was the first time I felt a sense of stability, a quiet confirmation that what I was building was beginning to hold its own weight. I locked the door and stood outside for a moment looking at the sign above the shop. It was still faded, still simple, but it no longer looked temporary to me. It looked like the beginning of something that had taken root. Something that did not need to be allowed to grow, something that could survive because it was built slowly, with intention, with patience, and with a kind of attention that most people overlooked until it was too late to dismiss. The first time I raised my prices, I did not tell anyone in my family. I changed the number quietly on the small printed menu near the front desk and waited to see if anyone would notice. For a long time I believed that charging more meant losing everything I had slowly built. But I also knew I could not keep working 12 hours a day and stay in the same place forever. Carol noticed first. She glanced at the menu and then at me and said, "You should have done this sooner." I did not respond right away. I simply continued shaping her nails with steady hands. That afternoon something else shifted, not in the room but inside me. I realized that the value of what I offered was not decided by the size of the space or the brightness of the sign outside. It was decided by the experience people carried with them when they left. Over the next few weeks, no one complained about the new prices. The ones who came for discounts stopped coming, but the ones who stayed began booking appointments in advance. They respected the time. They showed up early. They treated the space with the same quiet care I had given it from the beginning. I started hiring one technician to help during the weekends. Her name was Maria. She was in her early 30s and reminded me of myself when I first arrived. Careful, observant, always watching how others worked. I trained her slowly, not just on technique, but on attention. I told her to listen more than she spoke, to notice what was not said, to remember small preferences. She learned quickly, and soon the rhythm of the shop changed again. The chairs were filled more often. The waiting time grew, but it never felt chaotic. Everything moved at a pace that felt intentional. One evening, my daughter came back again. This time, she did not stand near the door. She walked in and sat down in one of the empty chairs without saying anything. I finished with my client and walked over. She looked around and said, "It feels calm in here." I nodded and asked what she would like. She hesitated and then said just something simple. I prepared my tools and began working on her hands. I noticed how tense her fingers were at first, how she kept looking at her phone, but after a few minutes she placed it down and sat still. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of filing and distant conversation. When I finished, she looked at her nails and then at me. She did not say much, only that they looked nice. But her voice was different, softer. As she stood up to leave, she paused and said her friends had started asking where she got her nails done. She did not sound embarrassed this time, just unsure how to explain it. I told her she could tell them the truth if she wanted, or say nothing at all. It did not matter to me. That night after closing, I stayed a little longer than usual. I wiped down each station carefully, adjusted the chairs, straightened the small display of colors near the front. Everything looked the same as before, but it felt different, more stable, more certain. The space that once felt temporary now carried a quiet sense of permanence. I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the stillness, realizing that what I had built was no longer fragile. It had moved past the stage where a single bad week could break it. It had become something that could stand on its own, not because it was large or impressive, but because it was consistent, grounded, and shaped by years of small choices that no one else had seen. choices that had slowly turned out into something steady and real. By the second year, I stopped measuring progress by how busy the shop looked and started measuring it by how often people came back. Without being reminded, there was a quiet kind of loyalty forming that did not depend on promotions or signs or noise. It showed itself in small, consistent ways, appointments booked weeks in advance, customers arriving a few minutes early and sitting patiently without checking the time, women bringing their mothers or sisters and saying, "You have to try this place. It is different." I never asked what made it different because I already understood. It was not the polish or the tools. It was the way they felt when they sat down. Maria became more confident in her work, and I trusted her with more responsibility. We developed a rhythm that did not need to be explained. She knew when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to move quickly and when to slow down. I noticed that the atmosphere of the shop remained steady even when it was full. There was no rush, no tension, only a calm flow that seemed to hold everything together. One afternoon the landlord came back again. This time he did not lean on the doorframe or glance around with doubt. He stood inside and looked at the chairs filled with customers and the schedule book near the desk. He asked how business was, and I told him it was stable. He nodded and mentioned that the lease would be up for renewal in a few months. His tone was different now, more careful, more respectful. I understood what that meant without asking. I had prepared for that moment long before it arrived. I had kept records, tracked every payment, saved what I could even when it was difficult. That evening after closing, I reviewed my numbers and realized something I had not allowed myself to fully accept before. The business was not just surviving, it was growing in a way that could not easily be replaced. Across the parking lot, the larger salon had changed its staff twice in 1 year. Their sign was brighter, but their customers did not stay. People came and left, drawn by discounts and quick service, but never forming any connection. I began to see the difference more clearly. One place was built on volume, the other was built on trust, and trust took longer to grow but lasted much longer once it did. My daughter started visiting more often, not always for services. Sometimes she would sit quietly near the front desk and watch. She asked questions about how I managed appointments, how I decided on pricing, how I handled difficult customers. I answered simply, without turning it into a lesson. I could see that she was trying to understand something she had once dismissed. One evening she stayed until closing and helped me wipe down the stations. She did not say much, but before leaving she looked around and said, "I did not realize how much work goes into this." I nodded and continued folding towels. There was no need to explain further. The work spoke for itself. That night, as I locked the door and stepped into the cool air, I noticed how different the parking lot felt compared to the early days. It was the same place, the same lights, the same surrounding stores, but my perspective had changed. What once felt temporary now felt established. Not because of size or appearance, but because of consistency, the kind that is built day by day without shortcuts, without attention from the outside, and without needing anyone else to believe in it before it becomes real. The lease renewal came with a higher number than I expected, not unreasonable, but enough to test whether what I had built could carry more weight. I read the document slowly at the small desk in the corner, the same place where I once circled expenses and wondered how long I could last. Now I was looking at a different question, not whether I could survive, but whether I could expand without losing what made this place work. I signed the renewal without negotiating, not because I was unsure, but because I had already decided that stability mattered more than short-term savings. The next step was not bigger signs or louder promotions, it was refinement. I replaced the worn chairs one by one instead of all at once. I upgraded the ventilation system so the air felt cleaner. I added a small shelf with tea and water for customers who stayed longer. None of these changes were dramatic. Most people would not notice them directly, but they felt them, and that was enough. Maria suggested we hire another technician as the schedule became tighter. I hesitated at first because I remembered how fragile everything once felt, but I also knew that holding too tightly could stop growth. We interviewed a few candidates and chose someone who understood the pace of the shop. Not just the technical work, but the quiet environment. I explained to her that speed was not the priority. Attention was. She nodded and listened carefully, and I could see that she understood. my daughter began asking more detailed questions. Not just about daily operations, but about long-term plans. She asked how I tracked returning customers, how I handled cancellations, how I decided when to adjust pricing. I answered each question simply, without turning it into something larger than it was, because in truth there was no single strategy, only a series of small consistent choices made over time. One evening she stayed after closing again and looked through the appointment book. She ran her fingers over the names written across the pages and said, "They keep coming back." I nodded and said, "Yes, they do." She was quiet for a moment and then asked if I had ever thought about opening another location. I did not answer right away. I looked around the room at the chairs, the tools, the small details that held everything together, and I said that growth did not always mean more locations. Sometimes it meant strengthening what already existed. She did not argue. She simply listened. Over the next few months, the shop reached a point where it no longer depended on constant attention to stay steady. Systems formed naturally. The schedule filled itself weeks ahead. The staff moved with confidence. And I found small moments during the day where I could step back and observe instead of react. Those moments were unfamiliar at first. I had spent so long working inside the process that standing outside of it felt strange. But it also showed me something important. What I had built was no longer just a job. It was a structure that could operate with consistency and care even when I was not directly involved in every detail. Late one afternoon, a woman came in and asked if I was the owner. I said yes. She introduced herself as someone who worked with small business acquisitions and asked if I had ever considered selling or partnering. I listened without reacting, the same way I had listened to everything else over the years. I told her I had not thought about it seriously. She smiled and left her card on the desk. After she left, I placed the card in the drawer without looking at it again that day. I did not feel excitement or fear, only a quiet awareness that another door had appeared. One I did not need to open immediately, because I had learned that the strongest decisions are not made in a rush. They are made when the foundation underneath them is already solid. For a few days, I did not think about the card she left on the desk. I focused on the routine that had carried me this far, opening the shop each morning, checking the schedule, greeting each customer with the same quiet attention. But the idea stayed somewhere in the back of my mind. Not as a distraction, but as a possibility that waited without pressure. One evening after closing, I opened the drawer and looked at the card again. The name was simple, the company unfamiliar, but the message behind it was clear. Someone from outside had noticed what I had built, not the sign or the location, but the pattern, the consistency, the loyalty that did not appear in advertisements. I placed the card back and decided to wait, not because I was unsure, but because I had learned that timing mattered as much as effort. A week later, she returned. Not during a busy hour, but in the late afternoon when the shop was calm. She sat down and asked if we could talk for a few minutes. I nodded and asked Maria to cover the front. We sat at the small desk near the window where I had once counted every dollar with concern. Now I listened as she explained how businesses like mine were valued, not by appearance, but by numbers and retention. She spoke about customer return rates, average ticket size, and long-term stability. Terms that once would have felt distant now sounded familiar, not because I had studied them, but because I had lived them every day. She asked if I kept records, and I told her yes, carefully, consistently. She smiled and said that was rare. Many owners relied on memory or rough estimates. I did not respond. I simply reached for my notebook and showed her the numbers. Years of entries, each line written by hand, each page a record of decisions made quietly. Over time, she studied them for a long moment and then looked up at me with a different expression, one that carried respect. She said that what I had built was stronger than many larger businesses she had seen. Not because it was big, but because it was dependable. She asked if I would consider an evaluation, not a commitment, just a way to understand what the business might be worth. I agreed without hesitation, not out of excitement, but out of clarity. I wanted to see the result of all those years measured in a way I had never allowed myself to imagine. The process took several weeks. During that time, nothing changed inside the shop. The same customers came in, The same conversations filled the air. The same steady work continued. But I began to notice something different in how I viewed it. Each appointment was no longer just a service. It was part of a larger structure that had value beyond the moment. My daughter became more present during this time. She asked to help organize records, to understand how appointments were tracked, how revenue was balanced against expenses. I allowed her to assist without turning it into a lesson. She moved carefully, as if aware that she was stepping into something she had once overlooked. One afternoon, she sat across from me and said I did not realize how much this was worth. I looked at her and said it was never about worth in the beginning. It was about building something that could stand on its own. She nodded slowly, understanding something deeper than numbers. When the evaluation finally came back, the number was higher than I expected. Not unrealistic, but significant enough to pause. I did not react immediately. I placed the paper on the desk and looked at it for a long time, not with disbelief, but with recognition. Every early morning, every quiet afternoon, every small decision had led to this point. Not in a dramatic way, but in a steady accumulation that could no longer be ignored. The woman across from me asked if I would be open to an offer if one came. I told her I would listen, the same way I had listened to everything else, without rushing, without reacting, because I understood now that the strength of what I had built gave me something I had never had before. The ability to choose. The offer did not come with excitement or pressure. It arrived in a plain envelope placed carefully on the desk during a quiet afternoon. The same woman sat across from me again and explained the terms slowly, not rushing, not trying to persuade, just laying out the structure of what they were prepared to do. She said they had studied the numbers, the consistency, the retention, and they believed the business could expand under their network while keeping its core intact. I listened without interrupting, the same way I had listened to customers for years, allowing the information to settle before forming any response. When she finished, she placed the paper in front of me and pointed to the number. It was $2.8 million. I did not react immediately, not because I did not understand the significance, but because I needed a moment to connect that number to everything that had come before it. The empty afternoons, the quiet doubts, the steady repetition of small tasks that no one else had seen, all of it had been building toward something that now had a measurable form. I thanked her and told her I would take time to consider it. She nodded as if she expected nothing less and left the shop without adding anything more. I placed the document in the drawer and returned to work. The rhythm of the day did not change. Customers came in. Conversations continued. The tools moved with the same steady pace, but inside me there was a new awareness, not of pressure but of possibility. That evening my daughter stayed after closing again. She had been helping more consistently, organizing records, reviewing schedules, understanding the flow of the business. I handed her the paper without explanation and watched as she read it slowly. Her eyes moved across the numbers and then back again as if confirming what she saw. She looked up at me and asked if it was real. I nodded and said yes. She sat down in the chair across from me and remained quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I used to think this place was small." I did not respond. I allowed the silence to hold the weight of that statement. She continued and said, "I did not understand what you were building." Her voice was not defensive or embarrassed, just honest. I looked at her and said it took time for me to understand it too. We sat there without speaking for a while, the room quiet. The lights dimmed, the reflection of the window showing the same space that once felt uncertain, now steady and complete. Over the next few days I reviewed the offer carefully, not just the number, but the terms, what would change, what would remain, how the transition would affect the customers who trusted this place. I spoke with Maria and the other technician. I explained the situation clearly, not as a decision already made, but as something we would move through together. They listened with a mix of surprise and pride, understanding that what we had built was being recognized beyond this small strip of stores. My daughter asked if she could be involved in the process, not as an observer, but as someone who wanted to help. I agreed, not because I needed assistance, but because I saw that she was beginning to see the value in something she had once overlooked. The final meeting was scheduled for a week later. During that time I continued working as usual, greeting each customer, remembering their preferences, maintaining the same level of attention that had defined this place from the beginning. Nothing about the daily routine changed, and that consistency reminded me of something important, the value of what I had. Built was not in the sale. It was in the years of steady work that made the sale possible. The number on the paper was only a reflection of that, not the reason for it. And when the day came to make a decision, I knew it would not be based on excitement or fear, but on the same quiet clarity that had guided me from the very beginning. The day of the final meeting arrived without any sense of ceremony. It was scheduled in the same quiet tone as every other decision that had come before it. The woman returned with a folder and a calm expression. We sat at the small desk near the window where so many other conversations had taken place. She reviewed the terms one last time, confirming each detail. With clarity and patience, I listened carefully, not searching for excitement but for alignment. When she finished, she placed the contract in front of me and slid a pen across the table. The room was still, the same way it had always been. The same steady atmosphere that had carried me through every stage of this journey. I picked up the pen and paused for a moment, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood the weight of what I was about to complete. Then I signed my name slowly and set the pen down. There was no applause, no sudden change, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had reached its natural conclusion. My daughter sat beside me and watched without speaking. Her expression was thoughtful, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just present. After the meeting ended, we remained in the shop for a while. The chairs were empty, the lights soft, the space familiar in a way that no number could replace. She looked around and said, "It feels different now." I nodded and said, "It always felt this way. We just see it differently." She turned to me and said, "I am sorry for not understanding before," her voice steady, not filled with regret but with recognition. I looked at her and said, "You do not need to understand everything at the beginning. Sometimes it takes time to see what is being built." She nodded and sat quietly, taking in the room, the details, the atmosphere that had once seemed so small to her. Later that afternoon, a few regular customers stopped by for their appointments. I greeted them the same way I always had. Nothing in my tone or movement changed. They spoke about their usual routines, their families, their plans for the weekend, and I listened with the same attention that had shaped this place from the beginning. None of them knew what had just been completed behind the scenes, and that felt right, because what they valued had never been about ownership or numbers. It had been about consistency, trust, and the quiet space we had shared over the years. As the day came to an end, I closed the register, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the doorway. The sign above the shop looked the same as it always had, simple, unremarkable to anyone passing by. But to me it carried every step of the journey, every doubt, every decision, every moment of patience that had brought it to this point. My daughter stood beside me and said, "I used to think this was something small." I looked at her and said, "It started small, but small does not mean insignificant. It just means it needs time." She nodded and did not say anything more. We walked to the car together, the parking lot quiet under the evening lights, the same strip of stores, the same surroundings. Nothing had changed on the outside, but everything had changed in how it was understood. And as I drove away, I did not feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was carrying it forward in a different form, one that no longer needed to prove itself to anyone, because it had already done that, quietly, steadily, and without asking for permission.